Welcome to, this is our third of 8 presentations by renowned climate scientist, Dr. Tom English, in his environmental education series. And Dr. English is a very accomplished scientist. He's been involved in so many issues, frankly, in our state and in our country's history. One that's most relevant to this topic is that he was the author of the California Clean Air Act back in the 1980s that had a lot to do with cleaning up California's smog problem. And so, you know, if you ever take a look at his bio, or I think the San Diego Union actually did a wonderful piece on him recently that talked about a lot of his accomplishments. It's just amazing. But anyway, he's a dear friend, and one of the things I love the most about Dr. English, he has the unusual ability to communicate difficult concepts in very easy to understand ways. And he has a huge passion for educating others on our climate crisis and the existential threats that it's bringing to us and to our children's generations. And we all need to be aware of what can be done to counter this. So the goal of this series is really to help all of us more clearly understand the main issues behind climate change and what can be done about it, so you can have better discussions with family and friends and become more involved in the issues. And my name is Dave Rice, and I'll be your host for the event. And so without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tom English.
Okay, good. Well, welcome to the talk. We're going to be talking about weird weather today. I think that this is a good week for weird weather, given the fiasco that went on in Texas. I've gotten a good number of comments from people about their interactions with some of their grandkids and their kids, and they're saying that this technique is actually working, where they're actually able to communicate with one another. So that makes me feel good, because that's the purpose of the whole series of the class here. So I'm glad that it's working for people. The slide here shows a hurricane and the effects in New Jersey, some fires here in California, Moscow, soaked with smog, a bunch of people, a guy questioning everything, a drought here. We're going to try to tie all that together. So a little background. Some people have been asking me about what kind of background do I have in this sort of thing. And I just thought I'd go over the meteorological qualifications. I thought they were pretty interesting. I've completed 2 graduate meteorological courses at Vanderbilt. That's why I was getting a postdoctoral degree at Vanderbilt in environmental engineering. I taught meteorology several times at Baltimore College. Dave already talked to you about the California Clean Air Act. I directed a health study called the California Chess program, where we were trying to determine what levels of pollution cause people to get sick. You know, what level would asthma start at, or chronic respiratory disease, or acute respiratory disease, or chromosomal aberrations, that sort of thing. And I was also technical director of the world's first regional air pollution study. So that gives you a little bit of the background. I've written a book on air quality management, emphasizing transportation sources. And I've also written a book along with Fred Krueger, my co-writer, called Witness for the Earth, showing how the religious movement ties in with the environmental movement. There we go. Here's the path, the roadmap we're going to follow today. Is there any weather news? Well, I think the answer's got to be yes on that one. We'll talk about some examples of predicting sea level rise and the impacts of it, and heat waves. I think you'll find both of those to be fascinating things. And then we'll talk about cost of delay. You know, why should we rush to fix these problems? Why don't we just wait a little bit longer? And we'll basically talk about what that costs. So let's start with the weather news, okay? I like this one here. It shows the characters from Wizard of Oz. I don't think we're in Kansas anymore. You're right, it's New Hampshire. So there's a tornado in New Hampshire. That's kind of weird. This is the Arctic. The Arctic is an interesting place. It basically is mostly sea ice. So this big white patch here of stuff is sea ice. And the ice is pretty thin. There's a big, thick piece of ice here called Greenland, but this sea ice is pretty thin here. So, and this Arctic Ocean is an ocean surrounded by land, whereas if we look at the Antarctic, we see it's a continent surrounded by an ocean. So we have some different symmetry between the North and the South. And what we'll find out is that they behave differently. This is sunlight hitting the ice in the Arctic. Notice what's happening to the ice? It's getting smaller and smaller. So what happens is whenever there's a lot of ice there, the sunlight hits the ice and bounces off to outer space. Whereas whenever the ice melts, the sunlight hits the same areas and gets absorbed by the ocean. So this is why the Arctic area is heating up at a pace about 3 times the pace of the rest of the planet. You're not going to have that in the South, because what happens in the South is you've got 2 miles of ice there. So you're not melting nearly exposing as much ocean there. So it's a very interesting situation. We get a place where the planet used to have a symmetrical view. You had a big white thing on the top, a big white thing on the bottom. And now the white in the top is going away rapidly, and the white on the bottom is staying about the same. So all of a sudden you switch from a symmetrical looking planet to an asymmetrical planet, and that has all sorts of implications for our weather system. So this is the Arctic. This is the Antarctic. So these are the poles, and we've already shown they behave differently. And so we have a very polar situation. So it's official. The weather's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. This is Hurricane Sandy from 2012. Hurricanes don't seem to be coming more frequently, but what happens is the hurricanes are getting bigger in extent. So they're getting to be a lot bigger, containing a lot more energy. And that makes sense. If you have a lot of extra water vapor coming up from the oceans, going into the sky, the water vapor has to go somewhere. So it increases the humidity of the atmosphere in general, but it also impacts all the weather processes. So things get bigger and tougher. This is an amusement park that Sandy hit, or what's left of it. So it's pretty interesting to see the kind of things that happened. Here's another view here. My wife liked this one here, the subway with the guy scuba diving in there. That's a pretty awesome picture. So if you have a hurricane like that, which takes out the subway system, that's pretty expensive. And if it occurs very infrequently, every 100 or every 200 years, something like that, you can actually afford it and take care of it. But if it occurs much more frequently, at some point in time, you can't afford to fix up the subway after it's flooded. So that leads to abandonment of the subways, abandonment of the cities. So this is a summary of the hurricane intensity. Basically, a hurricane like Sandy was expected in the 1880s to hit the New York area about once in 500 years. Nowadays, or in 2017, the expectation is 1 in 25 years. And if we continue to cause more and more climate change, what we expect is that we'll be getting to a very, very short period of time here, which is 1 in 5 years, within a decade or so. So if we get to 1 in 5 years, I doubt that we can afford to continue fix up the subway systems. So at some point in time, we may have to, unless we solve our problems, which I think we can. So if we don't solve our problems, we're going to have to start abandoning some of our cities. Some of you may have been paying attention to Texas. Jan and I love Texas. We spent 5 years there. She loves the barbecue. She thinks it's the best barbecue on earth. I and probably Rob Coffin would agree that North Carolina probably has better barbecue, but nevertheless, it's a great place. Very independent kind of place. So what's happened is they were hit by a freak kind of storm. Some people call it a polar vortex that basically took out their most of their electrical power grid. Now, what happened because of that is that they had made some decisions. They don't like regulations and all that sort of fussing around with the government. So basically, what happened is they decided to make their power grid independent from the power grids of the rest of the nation. So if you look at the electrical power system of the country, you have an eastern power grid and a western power grid, and some going across the mountains. But Texas is totally isolated from it. So they made that decision. They were told during a similar storm maybe a dozen years ago that they should do something about it, and they haven't. So what happened this time is the electrical power grid went out. It was pretty serious. My understanding was it was minutes away from a complete catastrophe, what would take months to fix. But they basically escaped that, but they had a serious problem for many days. And what happened there is they had problems with their water. Jan and I had experienced something like that earlier. We were visiting a place in Tahoe around Christmas time, beautiful clear sky, nice low temperatures, and the heating system for the place we were staying in broke. So no heat. And what happened is the pipes, basically they weren't well insulated. The pipes blew up. So we had all the pipes in the house and the walls blown up. So that's what's happened in Texas. They have home pipes blown up, sewer pipes blown up, supply pipes blown up. So it's a mess there. This is an interesting thing. Here's a guy with a bunch of cars here. You wonder what's going on there. It turns out what he's doing is he's directing traffic into a furniture store. People were going into the furniture store to keep warm. It's one of the few places that had some heat, so they're all hanging around the furniture store. Last Sunday, for Zakaria had Catherine Hayo on to discuss the Texas situation. Catherine is a professor at Texas Tech, and her specialty is meteorology. She's interesting also because her husband is a evangelical minister. So it's interesting to combine the evangelical group with the high tech. Anyway, Catherine discussed some of the insides of the problems in Texas. Here's basically what's happening here. Since the North is heating up much faster than anywhere on Earth, around the North Pole, it's getting to be warmer. On February 25th in 2018, the North Pole was 50 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than normal. Incredibly hot. So what's happening now is the Northwest Passage is opening up, and you can actually book a cruise ship. This is before the pandemic hit. You can actually book a cruise ship where you take a cruise through the whole Northwest Passage. You enter in near the New York area, and you basically exit near Alaska. So things are very different. We have basically two jet streams, one that sort of goes near the equator and one that goes further north. And this north one is normally fairly steady. Once in a while, it'll get distortions into it. And what will happen is with the energy in that distortion, this is called a polar vortex. Well, basically, it's a lot of that cold will come down, maybe close to 2,000 miles more than it would normally come down. So what that does is that basically exposes you periodically to more and more drastic cold. And when that happens, many places like Texas aren't prepared for it. And so they basically suffer from that. So there's the end of that section. Any questions so far?
Here's one that says, as the Arctic ice melts, does the Northwest Passage open?
Yeah, it's opening. As I was mentioning earlier, I think it's Holland America before the pandemic was actually booking cruises where you could actually get on a boat somewhere near New York or Boston and go through the Northwest Passage and come out in Alaska. So yeah, that's possible to do now. And with time, we're getting less and less ice, so it'll be even easier. So yeah, things are different than they were. This is not the way things were when we were kids.
Okay, good. And here's one from Marion that she just put in the chat. Where can we buy your book, Witness for the Earth?
Oh, you can get it on Amazon. Just go into Google and type in "witness for the earth" and then coalescing, and that'll get it for you. I think it's around I think it's around 15, 20 bucks. Fred Krueger, who I think is on the call, gets all the money from that.
Awesome. And then post-COVID, I'm sure you'll be happy to autograph.
Oh, I'd be delighted to, sure. Need the interaction.
Here's one more. Will Texas couple its electrical grid to the rest of the nation, do you think?
Well, I think Texans, based on my 5 years or so there, I think they're stubborn. So there's going to be some pushback or they don't want to couple. But I think just common sense will force them in. They're very practical also, in addition to being stubborn. So I think what the practical thing will just leap out and cause them to go ahead and do what makes sense. The problem for them will be basically accepting the regulations that the East grid and the West grid has. But I think they'll find it's too much to their advantage, so they'll do it.
Okay, excellent. And then two more quick ones. One on your book. Is your book, do you know if it's in any libraries anywhere around?
I think we sent it to a bunch of libraries, but I don't know where they are. I've never checked that out.
Okay. And then one from Robert asking, why do the vortices wind to the left?
Well, that one's weather sort of comes from the west, often because of this way the Earth spins.
Yeah.
So what happens there is it's also coming from the north, and so it's like coming from the northwest down. And I think that's not too unusual for these polar vortices. But what's happened is the weather that we're seeing is basically the same stuff we've been seeing since we've been kids, okay? Except we're getting much more of it. Yeah. Like you'd have hailstorms. Well, you're getting a lot more hailstorms. You would have water storms. You're getting a lot more of those. You're getting droughts. You're getting a lot more droughts. So what we'll do is go through a little bit of a way later in the talk. We'll show you how people like Jim Hansen. Jim Hansen's he's testified more about climate change than anybody else before the U.S. Senate. We'll show you his way of predicting how these things are going to go in the future. So you'll be able to do some of those predictions. The next part is basically discussing sea level rise and heat waves. I think they're both fascinating ends of the spectrum. One is basically sort of wet things. The other is very dry things. This is Jim Hansen, who I mentioned earlier. This is Fareed Zakaria. Jim did his thesis on the planet Venus. So he was interested in how Venus heated up. And whenever you do a PhD thesis, you're often not really happy with it. So what happens is you either totally avoid the subject for the rest of your career, or you spend your whole career redoing it. So Jim has been redoing the planet Venus, but only doing it on the planet Earth. So anyway, this is his view of sea level rise. If you look at the data here, this is sea level data, the way it's been normally taken before satellites. The red stuff is the satellite data. Basically what this says is over a century or so, the sea level has risen about 8 inches. So you say, well, 8 inches, that's not too bad. Problem is that it's going to be rising a lot faster than that. So Jim basically makes some predictions about that. And he basically is concerned with things like big blocks of ice coming off of Antarctica. These blocks of ice would be the size of Connecticut, for example. So these are really big blocks of ice. And if you have enough of that coming, what will happen is it contributes to the rise of the sea level. Sea level rise is caused by two things. One is the ice from the north and the south. And also a part is due to the fact that as the temperature of the planet heats up, the water simply expands. So it's roughly half and half. This is a map, a normal map you would get from AAA for the Miami area. And it shows the usual things, some highways, a few islands, a couple of bridges to the islands, and so forth. So what Hansen does is basically he does an analysis of how sea level rise will affect this map. This is the same thing, only shown more pictorially. This is for no sea level rise. So we see a little bridge here. These buildings look pretty nice. This is not well connected here. Freeways look pretty safe. So let's raise it 1 feet. If the sea level raises 1 feet, what happens is a couple things. The water supply begins to get screwed up because some of this salt water from the ocean starts to intrude into the aquifers. So they have a water supply issue. But 1 foot would take out some of these bridges, some of these connectors here. And this would be fairly easy to rebuild. So 1 foot is no super deal. I mean, it's handleable. If you have 4 feet, it's a little bit worse. You're going to have a tough time building these spans here and here and over here. And notice all the water interior here. So it's becoming much more swampy and threatening these roads here. At 5 feet, look at that. Looks like some sort of just series of little islands. The buildings are probably unusable then. This certainly is gone. At 10 feet, there you go. It's like there is no Miami anymore. So what Hansen is saying is this kind of sea level rise is based on his use of geological data. And he says this kind of sea level rise is very typical geologically. So if this happens to Miami, Miami's gone. You'd have similar problems with places like New York, Boston, and 80 other major seaports around the world. Let's talk about heat waves. So basically, we all like to stay cool when it's hot. And sometimes it gets to where you can't quite do that. Your air conditioning doesn't work as well. Maybe you don't have access to air conditioning. So a lot of people die from heat waves. The Supreme Court ruled on the idea of CO2 possibly being a pollutant that could be managed under the Clean Air Act. And to do that, you have to show some health effects. So the health effects they focused on were primarily death. So the EPA published a so-called endangerment finding. And what that showed is that CO2 can significantly increase heat waves, which can significantly increase death. So we'll go over some of the numbers behind that. This is Jim Hansen. I like his stuff because he has to put everything together, and he loves to use computers for that. By the way, this picture, I had the honor of taking the picture. One of our events at the Willard in Washington, D.C., about less than a block from the White House. So a little bit of history. We go back to our school days, and you remember they used to do a thing where they would grade you on a bell-shaped curve. This is the bell-shaped curve. And you would, the F's would be down here, the A's would be over here, the B's and C's are scattered in there. So that's the basic bell-shaped curve that is used by teachers. You can also use the same kind of bell-shaped curve with scientists. They talk about the fatness of the curve about halfway up here. That's what they call that 2 standard deviations. So they measure everything in terms of standard deviations. So here's the same bell-shaped curve, a little more colorful. We'll say blue is cooler than average, white is average, and red is warmer than average. Is everybody on board? Now what we'll do is we'll fit a smooth curve to that. That's called our baseline. It turns out that this curve, when measured for the planet Earth, hasn't changed much in the decades from 1950 to 1980. So the curve is just sitting there, just having a good time, not changing at all from 50 to 80. And we assume that that curve was basically the way it was back 100 years earlier. So let's look at the next decade. Oh, I should say on this curve here, that even though it doesn't look like there's anything here, way out here beyond the red, there still is 0.1% of the data out there. And you say, well, who cares about 0.1%? Well, normally you don't. But if you're worried about things like airplanes falling out of the sky or things like climate change, you start to care a little bit. And I'll show you why you care. This is the decade of 83 to 93. Notice the curve has shifted away from our baseline a little bit. So the blues have gone down, the reds are about the same, white's shifted over, and we have a new color here, brown. A little bit of brown here, extremely hot. That's in the 80s to 83 to 93. Let's go 94 to 2004. Notice here, the blue is much less, and the brown is much more. The extremely hot is much more. If we go to 2005 to 2015, this extreme area here, which used to cover maybe 0.1% of the Earth, now covers almost 15% of the whole Earth. So that's why more and more people are believing in climate change, because these things are really directly observable. These extreme events, occurring 0.1%, that's pretty rare, but 15% is not rare at all. So Jim Hansen looked at some of the data for the climate, and he tried to link that to the effects, the heat effects of deaths in a paper that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences called Perception of Climate Change. He basically looks at Texas in 2011, Moscow, and France. And he concludes that the events that occurred there would not have occurred in the absence of global warming, with a high confidence. This is Russia in 2010. I got to visit Russia for a couple of weeks working for the government there on teaching them how to do environmental management. Anyway, this is St. Basil's in Red Square. And in this August period, 55,000 people in Russia died due to heat waves. In Europe, in 2003, 70,000 people died of heat waves. So basically, if we go back and compare various decades, we'll compare the decade of 2001, this is our so-called baseline, 10 years, with the data in 2051. And we'll see what it looks like. So here we already have 2001 decade, looks like that. That's our baseline. This is what it looks like in 2051, using Hansen's predictions. So this extreme temperature events that were only roughly 0.3% are now 4.6%. So the effects, the effects there, the effects of death increased by a factor of 17. So Jim's data basically had 70 plus 55,000, say 125,000 heat deaths per decade. And he has a multiplier of 17. So that gets us to a much higher number, about 2.1 million deaths in the decade of 2051. That's a lot of deaths, folks. So this is a phenomenon that's very serious. This gives you some idea of how the deaths compare. The deaths, we talked about 2 million. In Korea, we had about 2.8 million. Korean War, Vietnam War, we had about 3 million. Iraq had about 1 million. So these are comparable to major wars. So here are some people saying the end is near. I guess they're basically doomsayers. Calamity is nigh. Be warned. Is this some sort of doomsday call? No, these are weather reporters. So with that, any more questions?
In the chat, it says, I worry that because Texas had the power failure and the media is promoting the fact that Texas had too much invested in solar and wind, that ultimately it will hurt environmental goals. What do you think?
Well, I think that she accurately states what the governor of Texas said, that basically the fault of the system was wind and solar. However, very few people in Texas say that. The fault appears to be the wind and the solar systems appear to hang in there pretty well during the storm. The fossil fuel plus nuclear plants didn't do quite as well. So he's identifying a problem, but he's not correctly identifying the source of the problem. So what will probably happen is we'll probably see more emphasis on both solar and wind in Texas a grid that's connected to the national grid, and basically some stricter regulations on maintenance to make the grid such that it can withstand these kind of real cold conditions.
Will other coastal cities other than Miami and New York be destroyed by sea level rise?
Oh, sure. Pick San Francisco, Silicon Valley. The graphs are awful there in terms of sea level rise. Same kind of effects. Major foreign ports will be destroyed. It'll be a wreck for the shipping of the world. So it's a big thing. Also, it's a major thing for the Navy. They'll have a whole lot of their bases destroyed. So it's a big thing, and it's going to be hard to what do you do with all those people? I don't know how many there are in New York, 10, 15 million, something like that. Where do you move those folks to? And migration due to climate effects are going to be a major thing. We see a little bit of that with the heat up in Syria and the failure of crops. They had a 17-year drought there, which led to something like 1.3 million farmers leaving the farm and basically out of work and scrambling into cities to get something to do and trying to get into other countries, led to major changes in the political structure within Europe. So there's going to be a lot of stuff changing, folks, that not for the good, unless we pick some changes up that really prevent all these things from happening. Okay, so let's talk about the cost of delay. Can we just delay this stuff forever, or are there costs associated with it? Here's a shot of the Pope. He basically did something historically significant. He called the leaders of the world's oil companies to Rome to basically discuss the idea that energy needs mustn't destroy civilization. I was in the middle of a conference that was sponsored by the Patriarch Bartholomew, who was sort of the mentor of the Pope on climate change. And Bartholomew was having this activity in Greece. And two of the main speakers had to leave the conference early because of the Pope's need to have those speakers to help him with these oil execs. So it's a problem. Yeah. The Pope tells the oil execs that there is no time to lose. Get busy. So this is an urgent thing. He says, you guys should be complimented for developing more careful approaches to what you're doing, but the actions that you've taken are not enough. He says, when will we turn the corner in time? That's a good question, folks. No one can answer that with certainty, the Pope says, but with each month that passes, the challenge of energy transition becomes more pressing. So he thinks it's a big, big problem. So let's go back to the first lecture. I like to go back and forth in some of these lectures to reiterate some of the points. This was basically an example of using some ice core data to determine temperature over time and also to determine the pollutants that were in the Earth's atmosphere over time. And we basically said that human existence is something like the order of 150,000 years or so. And what we see from the data is we see there's a high temperature, low temperatures, high temperature, low, and so forth. So one of these cycles here is called an ice age. And this goes back about 8 cycles here to about 800,000 years. And we also showed that they could measure in the ice cores some of the pollutants that were in the air. And we showed one of those pollutants. This one here is carbon dioxide. And what we see is the carbon dioxide goes up and down, similar pattern to the one we have there below with the temperature. So there appears to be some sort of relatability between the carbon dioxide and the temperature. There are differences though. So there are other pollutants we would have to take into account to really do a more detailed analysis. You'd have to track methane, for example. So the combination of methane and CO2 would give you a really good set of predictors for the temperature. But interesting, notice that these CO2 values stay within limits. They never get above about 300. They never get much below 200. So the planet is behaving in a very restricted way for about 1 million years. I think the data goes back about 3 million years. So what happens is it stays within this safety zone. So as long as the atmosphere has CO2 within these two bars, the extremes that we experience are handleable. But what happens is, so we normally don't get above 300. So let's see where we are today. We're at 400 today, actually around 414 or so. And it predicts in about 40 years, if we don't do something seriously, we'll get to about 600. So we really, this is a slide that says you shouldn't delay, that the stuff is serious. You need to do something quickly. So to keep track of things, let's use traffic colors. So green would be within the boundary, the safe zone. Yellow would be slightly above the boundaries. My limit for that is 350. I picked that because of the organization 350.org. Let's assume their number really has some meaning. And red means stop, you're way above it. So let's look at where we've been. This is the safe zone, the green light. Caution light. We'll go back to about the time of Abraham Lincoln, the stop sign. So basically, if we look at the data up to about 2015, what we see is during the early industrial revolution, we stayed in the green zone for a while, crossed into the caution zone, and are now into the stop zone. Now, if we assume, just for the sake of argument, that some phenomena occurs like Tinkerbell out of Peter Pan occurs, and overnight just stops all the fossil fuel emissions. So what would happen? That would be like a step function. It will take some time for the pollution to work its way out of the atmosphere through normal processes. So how long will it take to get back to the caution zone? And there it is. We're back there in about 85 years. So what that says is you just can't do some things and then basically on the weekend say, gee, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Let's fix it right away. It's going to take, using normal techniques, about 85 years after we stop the emissions of fossil fuels. So that's one example. Now, suppose we don't, Tinkerbell doesn't appear as early as 215. Let's say Tinkerbell comes along at 230, maybe a decade or so in the future. But then we see it takes a lot longer time to get to the yellow zone. So 270 years if we basically delay until 2030. And if we delay till 2050, it's going to take us 1,000 years. So if these storm-like phenomena, the hurricanes, the floods, the droughts, the forest fires and all that, we're going to be stuck with those for a long time. Unless we basically get our act together quickly, hopefully much quicker than 2050, to allow us to solve the problem. We can also make this better if we figure out some clever ways of taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere. These curves are all based on simply not putting it into the atmosphere after a certain point. But if you figure out how to take it out of the atmosphere, you can do much better. So we're going to have to do a combination of both. We can do things like properly managing forests. That would be a good thing because the forest can be effective in taking CO2 out of the air. So there's a book called Drawdown, which basically looks at the various options that we have. It goes through like 100 or so options and shows that it's very doable in terms of costs and that we can actually improve our quality of life while doing it. So our problem is basically this problem we used earlier, and that is the problem of putting a frog into hot water. If you put the frog into hot water, the frog leaps out. If this climate change stuff just occurred overnight, we would solve it. But what happened is we got into a thing where you put the frog into the water and you gradually heat things up around it. And so for the last 50 years or so, we've been gradually heating things up and we're enjoying the heating up. So the sense of urgency has gotten lost. But I think we need a big effort to do this thing quickly. We need a World War II kind of effort. And I think we can do that if we choose to. The Biden administration is basically proposing this kind of effort. And I think it would be a good thing for many things, solving the problem, also helping to create a lot of jobs to help us recover from this COVID situation. This is a spreadsheet from the book I mentioned earlier, the Drawdown book. It basically shows that we can save the amount of CO2 that we need to in the time we need to, and also save about $74 trillion to improve our quality of life. So these are things we should do anyway, even if we didn't have a climate problem. And by the way, we also save the Earth as a habitable place for us humans. This is a cartoon from the San Diego Union Tribune. It shows Atlas holding the world on his shoulders, talking to, I guess it's Zeus. And he says, it's a repo from the humans. They couldn't handle the maintenance. Well, I believe that Major General Mike Leonard had it right here. He ran Pendleton and 22 other bases. And Marines, a tough guy, but a very nice guy. This is him with Congressman Pete McCluskey. He said a country that's worth fighting for is a country that's worth preserving. I think that's true. So let's both fight and preserve the country. This is from a speech by Bill Ruckelshaus, who was the first administrator of EPA. He says, if every one of us will adopt the simple truth that I can save the Earth, we will realize how much we can achieve together. So let's get out there, folks, and do some things. I love this one here. This is a picture of the Red Sea parting. This guy looking like Charlton Heston here is Moses. And they're the children of Israel coming through the parting of the Red Sea. And in the book of the Bible, it talks about what God says around here. He says, see, I put before you the chances of life and prosperity, death and destruction. This day I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. I would like you to choose life so that you and your children may live. So that's what we need to do, folks. We need to choose life. So with that, let's take your questions.
Do China's and India's leaders have that sense of urgency about these issues?
That is a great question. Let's do China first. I got to spend about a week with a guy from the Politburo of China. I think there's like a dozen people who run the place. And I was his host in LA. And the basic takeaway was that this guy is very practical, very sensible, and extremely well educated. So I think the Chinese will do what is practical. Now, let's look at their track record. Kind of things we would like to see them do would be to, for example, build renewables. They've built more renewables in 2 years than we, the US, have built in our whole history. So they got the ideas that renewables are good. They also have the idea that fossil fuels are not good, but they don't kind of know how to get rid of things like coal very quickly. I think they're working on it. They're working on it much more industriously than they used to work on it. But it's still a problem. They have a problem of essentially providing electricity for a whole lot of people. So they have to basically build new electrical sources quicker than they can take down the old sources. So it's a tough problem for them. I think their heart is in the right place. I think the Indians have a similar situation. They discovered a little bit later that a smart way to go economically is wind and solar. For example, in the US, the Department of Power and Light in LA basically let out a contract for a solar system where basically, including batteries, where basically the cost was roughly half the cost of putting in a natural gas system. So I think the economics are strongly, very strongly in favor of the renewables. So I think both the Indians see that, the Chinese see it. If you look around the world, something like 70, 80% of new electrical construction last year was associated with renewables. So that's where things are going. I think everybody understands it. The problem is we probably have to do what we're doing, but do it more quickly. So we have to probably get everybody with a sense of urgency. But I think both the Indians and the Chinese understand that the droughts that they're having, the fires that they're having, the death that they're having, that these things are bad things, and they want to avoid them.
Christine asks, how much of an influence can households have by retrofitting homes to solar and other energy-saving features? Is it significant? And then Marion asks, what, kind of along the lines of what you were just saying, what are some actions that we can take now as individuals?
Well, let's do the first one, the solar and insulation kind of things at home. The cost savings are enormous. I put in a solar set of panels in my house. I'm now in a retirement community, so I can't put anything on the roof here. Yeah, when I moved here a couple of years ago, I had a house in Carlsbad, and we put in a 5 kilowatt system, and it was a nice system. You couldn't see it from the street, so there was no kind of visual problems with it. The money was great. Our payback time ended up somewhere around 4 or 5 years, and the reason is because we were basically we put all the insulation in first and new plumbing in first to get the air conditioning so it didn't leak all over the place. And what that did is made our heating and cooling really small. And then we bought an electric car, and that basically reduced our cost of electricity to basically very small because we're getting electricity off the roof of our house. So the payback time was, like I say, about 4 or 5 years for the system. And that's a marvelous payback time. In Silicon Valley, if you had a number anywhere, somewhere near around 4, it was like a no-brainer. You just go ahead and do it. So from the economics, it's a good thing. Now, we have to do more than basically just figure out how to make money. But if we basically look at things like we'd like our society to be more livable, you don't want to spend a whole lot of time driving everywhere. You might want to look at mass transit systems. They're discovering that in many places around the world. I mean, you see big cities, New York, Boston, Moscow, Stockholm, Paris. They wouldn't work without mass transit. So what we're trying to do is we're learning from those places how to do mass transit, and places like San Diego are trying to develop a mass transit system. But the thing you're finding out is it's tricky because if you have a mass transit system, you have to have people to use the system. So the idea of just having people build in random places far from the city doesn't really work. You need to have people that are going to be living somewhere near the stations. So you need a combination of the system and housing that goes along with it.
So here's one. Is there any way to speed up the 1,000-year schedule for restoring our atmosphere?
The answer is there are many ways. In the book Drawdown, which I think is one of the biblical books that are out there that basically tell you how to do some of these things. I think it costs like 15 or 20 bucks, and it's a great book. Been around for a dozen years or so now. Anyway, it basically shows like the impact of tropical rainforests, the impact of agriculture, the impact of other rainforests. So what happens is if you can store the CO2 in the trees, That's better. The trees require, if you plant a lot of trees, they're going to basically take the CO2, some of it out of the atmosphere. So it looks like it's a very cost-effective way to go. It's something that I'm getting very, very interested in, and I need to learn more about it. But it looks like a very attractive technique. People are also looking at things like, can you basically hook a scrubber up to a smokestack and take the CO2 out? And the answer is sure, you can do that. It's just a matter of cost. So some of the early cost factors for basically putting CO2 scrubbers on smokestacks, to me, doesn't look too good. You know, it's like maybe you'd have to have one scrubber for 3 plants, essentially, for the cost of 3 plants. So the economics is not favorable. So I think we'll just find out more clever ways. Some people are saying we can change our whole agricultural scheme to one that basically protects the topsoil better, that absorbs a heck of a lot of CO2, and basically gets rid of a whole lot of ingredients that you necessarily wouldn't want to eat as part of your food supply.
And can you discuss home battery storage? How can we electrify our homes and reduce natural gas usage of methane?
The batteries have come a long way. I mean, it's I guess Elon Musk had the concept of basically taking computer batteries for small computer systems and stringing them together into a big battery for a car. So that's one way to go. I think that's a little bit of a primitive way today. I understand that there are tanks in Israel that use batteries, and that if you were to take one of those batteries and stick it into a Tesla, assuming everything would fit right, that you could get roughly a range of 500 to 1,000 miles in the Tesla with the Israeli type battery. And the Israeli batteries are becoming, I guess they're not as fancy or not as advanced as they used to be. So there are new ways coming along with things like aluminum oxide, things that don't require any water. They just use air. And so they're lighter, they're able to put more energy per cubic foot into the batteries. So I think that batteries are going to be a big thing. My wife is currently telling all our grandkids to get a career in batteries.
A reminder that next Thursday, we're going to be talking about climate change and us. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, there will be even more detailed discussion about drawdown and exactly what folks can do. A lot of the questions that are happening now.
Yeah, that's precisely right. We're going to talk a lot about the drawdown and sort of examples, electric cars, things like that. What do they really accomplish? Some of the things they accomplish are not really planned for. Like, for example, if you buy your electric car so you can go fast, so you don't have to pollute with the use of fossil fuels. But you also, by the way, solve most of the major air pollution problems of major cities. Just as a sidelight. So we'll talk about some of those details.
Have you tried to get solar panels on the roof at Wesley Palms, which I believe isn't that where you live?
Yeah, we live in a retirement community called Wesley Palms, and it's we have around 300 people in the community. Some of the people live in a centralized tall building. Some of them live in basically they're called patio homes, which are the small buildings that like cottages. And I live in one of the cottages. And yeah, when I first came here, we organized a group of people to look at the issue of putting solar panels on anywhere around Wesley Palms. And they were the organization of Front Porch was very, very supportive of that. And we went into all sorts of details. There were a few problems that we found along the way. One is that the roof of the main building was sort of like walking on a trampoline. So the roof would have to be displayed, it would have to be replaced. So that was a unsuspected kind of thing. But we also found out that nobody really knew what the electrical wiring system was for the whole place. So it's kind of hard to put a major new electrical thing in without understanding the electrical system. So that was a cost thing. So what they decided to do was, instead of doing it here, they were going to do a prototype in another Wesley Palms type community, front porch community, called Frederica Manor. And the prototype is, I believe it's being started there. So the ideas of money, nobody argued about the cost savings, that they felt the cost savings were very attractive. And so I think that at some point in time we'll have them.
I have to say, I know that San Diego as a community is probably one of the more advanced communities in our state and in our country. Yesterday, there's an initiative in San Diego called I Love a Clean San Diego, and they had an excellent webinar with a number of the young folks that are very involved in this. It was really inspiring. If anybody's interested in that, I'm sure you can find a copy of it. They have copies of it on YouTube.
Good. So you went to Len Herring's webinar?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, some of you may not know Admiral Len Herring. He was the so-called honorary mayor of San Diego, the military mayor of San Diego. And he's big on things like management, environmental management, and basically cleaning things up. So I highly recommend his programs.
And Robert has a comment that says, I've been told that Gandhi said to his followers that in essence, no one notices your cause unless people die, a lot of people. Yeah, any comment on that?
Well, I think there's some truth to that. It's the frog in the cool water. He enjoys it. And so we're used to enjoying what we have and sort of downplaying the problems that we have. And I think in Pittsburgh, there was a great saying that no one ever got a medal for fixing potholes.
Yeah.
So maintenance doesn't score high on anyone's career path. But if you don't do the maintenance, what happens is the thing gets unlivable after a while. So I think that's where we are now. We've been through, we've known about this climate stuff being nasty for, I don't know, maybe 30 years or so for sure. And we've basically tried to delay doing anything about it. And we're now to the place where most of the folks that I talk to, including some of the people on the Pub's Academy of Sciences and people on the National Academy of Sciences, believe that we have roughly 10 years to seriously get major programs underway where we make giant progress that starts with like a World War II effort now. So that if we do that, we can basically avoid the very serious problems that are facing us. Otherwise, we're talking about situations where, again, in the old days, this would not be very believable, but today, an awful lot of people believe it, like the Pope's Science Academy, that we're in danger of possibly driving humans to extinction this century. So it's, no more people this century. So what we have to do is basically recognize that, hey, even though we're enjoying our time in the lukewarm water, it's time for us to get out and to fix the situation. So we really need to get busy, and we need to talk to people about the issues and let them know that we think these issues are very, very compelling, and that there are ways to solve these issues that basically improve our quality of life. So you're not really asking for people for big sacrifices. What you're asking them to do is basically to relook at what they do, like maybe a little bit more walking, a little bit more swimming, a little bit more shifting towards away from beef, things like that. Definitely getting away from fossil fuels.
Well, and if we needed a wake-up call, it seems like the COVID experience certainly is one of those. And I know that in your last presentation on April 1st, you're going to be talking about COVID-19 and the climate crisis and the relationship.
Yeah, I
Um,
think there's a lot of similarities between the two problems. They're both the kind of things that, like COVID at first was dismissed as not being a big deal. Okay, so basically, you didn't get a whole lot of action out of the White House or the Congress on COVID. Uh, then what happened is it sort of started to get serious, and now it's like our whole economy is threatened and so forth. Uh, so that's again the frog in the cool water kind of problem. I think the same thing with climate change, except with climate change, the numbers that you would expect in the way of deaths are much more severe than what you could expect from COVID. COVID is serious enough. I mean, you've got what 500,000 U.S. folks already dead from COVID. So, I mean, we're talking about that number versus possibly the extinction of humanity. So, you know, so what the idea is to learn from our lessons that we did right and did wrong on COVID and make sure that we, in the climate plans, make sure that we do the things that we did right, but don't do the things we did wrong.
it seems that deniers of climate change often tend to be religious fundamentalists and therefore a large hindrance to action. Have you noticed an increase in interest about climate change among religious institutions, in addition to the Pope?
Oh, yes, yes. So like, for example, Catherine Cahill, the one that was being interviewed by Fareed Zakaria on this Sunday. She basically gets an awful lot of speeches all over the country nowadays. So she is very well received, and she basically is a strict evangelical. So what's happening in the evangelicals is that the young kids are pretty much on board, and they basically would think the way that most of you folks would think. The older ones think that this is not an issue, and they basically, their arguments are that they don't really understand it. And I think what I did is I tried to develop this course in a way so that you can speak civilly to the climate deniers. I've had a lot of discussions with climate deniers, and basically, if you stick to, you know, the reality as opposed to the politics of it, what happens is they get interested, and the conversations go on, and some of them basically, you know, decide, oh, this is a problem, I want to help out.
Okay, I think the interesting thing as I look around and I see, because I live in another front porch community like Wesley Palms, only this one is called Villa Gardens. And about 4 years ago, we had a committee, we had about 20 people interested out of our 200 plus people in having solar panels on our roof. But at that time, even though the director was very impressed with the idea, it didn't work. Um, I'm hoping that we can get it to work in the future, but maybe we have a spongy roof too. I mean, who knows what some of the drawbacks could be. But I'm really interested in the fact that during COVID, we were able, with whatever they called it, you know, uh, the Project Warp Speed or so, and we produced the from various places in the world have produced the vaccines. Now, the problem has been with the more political thing of getting them out to people. But we should be able to organize that too. I have been so amazed during the whole year that we have basically been locked down, um, that our local ABC station has been featuring what they call good news stories. I have been amazed at how many things people are doing during the pandemic. And many people have compared this with the effort that was put into American effort during World War II. I think we just have to convince people that the time is now. And I'm really looking forward to the drawdown next week because I'm in a series of 4 drawdown workshops right now. And I also joined the Citizens Climate Lobby, and their state meeting is this weekend, Saturday afternoon and Sunday afternoon. So I just think we need people to say now is the time, if not before. if you're interested, in 2015, the National Geographic September issue took on the 115 coastal cities that were going to suffer from sea rise. The whole issue was devoted to it.
Yeah, the opportunities that we have in front of us are staggering. They're just all sorts of opportunities. So what it takes is just some interest. So folks like you, for example, could make a giant contribution to the organizations that you're with.
It is the young people that will have to live with it. I have a grandson who is 26. He was born in 1995. So he is probably, maybe, hopefully will live through the century. No.
Well, I mean, that's awesome to see that kind of activism, Carolyn. That's just terrific, and it's what we need. Robert has a question, or a question here that's interesting, and that says, "Have you ever seen a public venue where deniers and warmers get anywhere in the discourse?"
Yes, I have. Some of it's been accidental. Like I went to a 3-day meeting held by the Cornwall Alliance. What's the other group, Robert? I've forgotten. In Las Vegas, at the Mandalay Hotel, and the rooms were very cheap, and the food was, I think the food was subsidized, and there were about, I don't know, 600-700 people there, and I was there as a enviro, and the other people were all deniers. So it was delightful in the conversations, because it was like I was very popular because there weren't many non-deniers there. And so if you talk to them nicely, it's like, oh my goodness, they start to say, well, you got some points there. And so you make some changes. I think the changes come gradually, but I think if you're pleasant about it, what happens is that the people will listen to you. And if you're factual, if you use the kind of information, for example, that we're using in this set of presentations here, I think that helps them because they're not aware of a lot of this stuff. So awareness goes a long way. So yeah, I feel pretty positive about that, Bob.
Yeah, I would say I agree. And also, I've noticed, especially coming out of the social justice movement that's going on right now, we have a number of things involved there. There's a number of growing groups online that are encouraging folks on different sides to come together and to learn how to have discussions where they disagree. There's a group, for example, called All Sides Talk, and other groups like that, where you can just sign up and just sort of say, hey, I'd like to, be involved and answer a survey, and then they'll link you with folks opposite from you. And so there is more and more of that sort of thing happening, interestingly.
Someone just said, Mary Del Chu said, eat more vegetables and less meat. But then I thought, well, almonds, a pound of almonds takes an immense amount of water to make. I'm trying to, for the environment, but especially for my own health, trying to cut down on meat. Mm-hmm. Maybe people won't all die off, because there are places farther north, like Canada and Russia, where people can go where it's not going to be as hot. So those are three sort of.
Nana, you might want to go back. Did you, were you there for the first presentation?
Are you asking?
Yeah, he's asking, were you at the first one on perspectives?
I was.
11th, yeah. Maybe
okay,
not.
well, there's a little bit in both that one and the second one. The problem of extinction is one of, the way we're going now, we're basically killing off a bunch of species rapidly. It leads to a prediction of the so-called sixth mass extinction, which means that half of the plant and animal species of the planet will be gone by sometime this century. So what happens is that then threatens your food web, the thing that basically allows us to get food. And so once you threaten the food web for such a populous species as ours, you're going to have incredible wars and things like that. And it's kind of hard to see how people could lead much of a life with a extremely damaged food web. I've looked at like many food webs, and if you kill off half of the plant and animal species, the efficiency of the food web and converting sunlight through the so-called photoplankton, the things in the ocean, up to the top chain of the food web, the efficiency gets really, really low. And so it's just that the Earth just doesn't have the resources to, feed many people. So now whether they all go extinct or not, no one knows for sure. But it looks like a very bad crash unless we avoid it.
Mhm.
How about moving north?
Well, there are all kinds of survival things you can do, but again, the species, some of the northern species basically get wiped out in the process. So it makes it tougher for those people to continue surviving. It's sort of like you're really in a situation where if you just try to avoid the problem, like going somewhere where the problem isn't, that's going to solve it for you, because there really aren't that many places. There's a guy in the Pasadena area who was he's the founder of a place called Aero Commander or something like that. It's an environmental group out of Pasadena, and he basically was going to head to New Zealand to avoid the nuclear war, to be one of the last ones to go down. And I explained to him that would probably work and give you some delay and so forth and so on. But I explained to him also that if he were to take some small amount of his energy and to give speeches to prevent nuclear war, he wouldn't even have to move to New Zealand. And he would also prevent the war. And that's what he ended up doing.
And Robert has a comment here that says he would like to advance the thought, not his, that policy prescriptions from so-called experts are taken by the public with mixed enthusiasm because the directives don't translate well.
Oh, Bob, I think that basically the science and the what shall we call it, the political community in general do a lousy job of communications. I think they just have forgotten, the idea of how to tell a story. So I think that if we do a better job trying to tell our story to people, what happens is they're shocked to hear a coherent story and they like to listen. So I think that we have a grand opportunity in terms of the audiences being primed for better communications.
Well, absolutely, and I think on that note, that's a good way to end this session, because that's exactly what this is all about: is to improve communications and to increase our awareness and understanding. So again, thank you so much for this excellent presentation. We continue to learn every week, and yeah, everybody give a nice little round of applause. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your week, and we will see you next Thursday.